Hey gang, Scott here, continuing our exploration of ON1 masking tools, this little mini series on masking with ON1 Photo Raw and ON1 effects. The subject of this video, the masking bug. And the masking bug has several different shapes. We'll talk about the gradient shape in this video, cover the others in a couple of other videos. So these will end up being nice little targeted lessons you can visit in the future if you need a refresher on a particular shape. Keep these things kind of bite-sized. So masking bug, what does the bug mean? It's kind of called the bug because of how it looks on the screen. I'll show you this in a minute here or so. But you want to use this masking tool when you have a large area of your photo that needs to be masked. You're doing something with a filter or a local adjustment. It's going to apply to a pretty broad segment of your photo. The masking bug is a great choice to start with. So let's first cover the masking bug itself, the controls, and then I'll show you a couple of examples of this in action with the gradient shape. That's the focus of this video. So let's get into it. We'll use this photo here as our example to introduce the masking bug. First thing I need is a filter. I need something to mask. So let's just add something very obvious, antique, so we can clearly see something's been applied. But to cover the tool itself, I'll just show the full mask here. But let's say we're working with a filter. We decide, I want to do some masking here. An obvious one for this photo would be to do something with the sky, bring down the exposure and so forth. And we'll do that as a real-world example, along with one other thing on this photo in just a minute. But let's go ahead and get into this antique here and see the bug in action. So we'll click on the masking options there, and we get our mask group opened. We have our brush, we have our bug. So I click on the bug, and the controls we have a preset, which really chooses a shape and either, either a circular elliptical shape or a traditional gradient with a certain positioning. You can choose the shape directly for the bug, center, edges, gradient, reflected gradient, and we'll cover each of these in individual videos. For any bug that you place, you can set its opacity, how strong or how weak is that mask. You can intersect it with a color range, and turning on color range, that is the same thing as color range in your masking options at your filter or at your local adjustment. It's just here for convenience. You can adjust the range of the color range, and then finally you have add, delete, and reset. You can add more than one bug to a particular filter as you build up a mask. And if you've added one and realize you don't need it, you can delete that bug and, of course, reset the entire mask. So now let's turn on the view here. So I'll click view so we can see the mask. The mask is pure white. And presets, I'll be honest, I don't use them. I'll choose a shape and just start positioning the bug on my photo where I need it. And it's a faster workflow for me. I know either I want a gradient, which is my straight edge, reflected, you'll see that in a different video, or I want something elliptical, which is center and edges. We're talking gradient in this video here. I've got that selected, and I just drop it down on the image. We have a few controls now on screen to position and shape the gradient. So we have this larger center pin. That is where you can drag and move and position where your gradient needs to be. The second smaller circle is for rotation, so you can click and rotate. And of course, rotation is based on this center part, this pivot, right? Where do you want to have your pivot point? That can certainly change how it reaches into the scene here. Sometimes it's a little easier to have the pivot not in the center. It just all depends on the photo, but you've got position, you've got rotation, and then the dashed lines on either side, drag them inward or outward for feather, right? So that straightens out the feather of just the masking bug. Remember, from the overall masking, you have feather options for your entire mask. Right over on the right-hand side, there's a feather slider. That is for the mask as a whole, right? You can still do more feathering with the mask if you've painted other things in or built up a complex mask. This feather is just for the bug you've placed on your image. Opacity for just the bug, we have controls for that here. And if for any reason I needed to add a second one, I can click Add. I have now dropped a second one on here, and you can intersect these and create interesting shapes. There's my first bug. There's my second bug. My second bug is removing things from the left-hand side. My first bug is removing things from the bottom, and so you're left with just this little bit up in the upper quadrant. Honestly, multiple bugs within a single filter, rarely use them, if at all. They tend to overlap like this, and if you have something specialized where you needed to mask this particular area, I'd usually either go for a brush or some other tool. So I will select this one and delete it. And that covers all of the controls for the bug. So to recap, we have the large center to position the bug. We have the smaller rotation arm to angle the bug for a gradient. And then we have the feather of the gradient. We have the opacity, and you can hover over the word opacity and click and drag on the word, or you can use a slider there as well. So those are all of the various controls for a gradient. I want to give you one tip about rotation and controlling rotation, fine-tuning it. And that has to do with this pin here for rotating. It's very close to your pivot point, your fulcrum. Well, if you click and you start rotating, if you drag your cursor out, now I'm still clicking and holding, so I'm still rotating. I now have a lot more control to get that fine-tune angle for my gradient. So if you find working really close to the pivot is, clunky and it's jittery, click and hold, drag out far away from your pivot point, and you can get a fine-tuned rotation on your gradient masking bug. So that's the controls. How about we look at actually using this to work on our photo, a real live example of these things in use. So let's get into that. With this image, there's a couple of things I'd want to do straight away that are that call for the gradient. It's a good natural fit for the gradient. One is just to darken the sky and just take some of the highlights and the haze out of that sky. And another is to slightly darken the foreground, bring that up here, and draw the eye toward the subject, which are these trees being lit by the morning light. First, let's deal with the sky. And both of these will be good choices for locals, right? Local adjustments. Now, if you recall, we click local and we get a mask automatically added for us. And it's the local mask group, not the mask group we just looked at. However, we have a brush and we have what they call an adjustable gradient. If I click the adjustable gradient, it looks exactly like the masking bug. It is the same tool with the same controls with a different name. I know it can be a little confusing. I have a different video that does my best to demystify why there are different groups for masking tools. But nevertheless, if you are working with local adjustments, you'll get one of these bugs available. It just happens to be called the adjustable gradient. So I have my gradient shape chosen. Exposure happens to be that. I'll just click this on the photo and then start to adjust things, and we'll feather that out a little bit. This actually doesn't need much rotation, maybe a tiny bit to the ridgeline kind of goes that way. Exposure does not need to be that far down. I may actually take temperature and take the temperature down a little bit, introducing a little more blue into the sky. Maybe the highlights come down and the haze can be decreased. You can see a whole lot. Let's make that a little more natural before and after. So that's one example of using the gradient to take care of a sky. Now, if you're using Photo Raw, You might be going, well, Scott, why didn't you just select the sky? It's like, well, we would do that. If I was in Photo Raw, I would do that. And we'll get to sky selection in Photo Raw later on in this masking series. But if you're working with effects as a plugin like I'm doing right now, you don't have sky selection, but you do have the gradient here in the local adjustment area. Now, a second thing I'd like to do here is to darken the foreground a little bit. So I'll add another adjustment in the locals, and we'll stage our exposure slider to maybe 0.3. I have my gradient shape chosen. The tool remembers that was the last thing I chose, so I can work with it again. This time I'll just click it on the photo here, and I can rotate it around so we can see that darkening there. If I make that adjustment very dark, it becomes quite obvious where I'm working. And we'll darken our foreground some like this. I can set the slider to where it needs to be, just drawing that eye up a little bit more before and after. So that's another example of using the gradient. It's I got a large area of the photo I need to work on. Let me use the gradient to take care of that. And you notice I'm not worrying too much about the fade and the gradation there. If I hit the O key here, you can see that there's a pretty healthy fade. And let me change my mask view mode to red. You can see that's starting to bleed into the trees themselves, but it looks natural, right? It just looks fine. So when you're working with the gradient, you can intersect it with other tools, use your brushes, really fine-tune things. But sometimes that just natural fade is what you need for the photo. And that's a key thing when you're thinking about using the gradient shape. It is going to be just a pretty broad stroke of a mask across your entire scene. Maybe one more example just to drive this home. We'll go back into effects and let's add dynamic contrast. That's adding contrast to the entire photo. It's actually a little strong for my taste, so I'll back that off, but let me leave it at 100% for the moment. What I wanted to cover here is that it's adding contrast up into the sky. I don't want that. I'll open up the masking area. I'm in the masking tool. I'll choose my masking bug. My shape is gradient. Click the gradient there. You can tell by the swatch it's being applied to the sky and removed from the foreground. We'll rotate that around so we have the exact opposite. And maybe I'll encroach this down even a little farther into the scene so I get this nice fall off of my contrast before and after. So that foreground gets the pop that I want. I can refine the strength of that. And the sky is not getting any contrast. I want that sky to be not so detailed, just nice and soft. So that is the gradient shape of the masking bug. It's pretty straightforward to use. Drop one of those onto your photo, position it with that center circle. Any type of rotation you can do with that smaller pin to the right of your center point. Feather it out as you need. And then, of course, adjust your sliders so that you're changing the photo the way that you want it. We added ultimately 3 different gradients here to this photo. And just those 3 gradients, before and after, we're already improving the story of the photo, drawing the eye into the center of this scene. Because that's ultimately why we do masking, right? We do masking for selective adjustment to guide our viewer to the more important, the more compelling parts of our photo. So that's going to do it for this video. I hope you join me later on in the series for the reflected gradient shape as well as center and edges. Until next time, my name is Scott Davenport. Have fun.